Hello, and welcome to Sex, Love, and the Self. Over the past several months, I've been ever more aware of the ways in which I'm growing and the importance of relationships in that process. It's easy to create and refine ourselves, our beliefs, our perspectives in the highly curated sphere of our realities. But as we carry these versions of ourselves out into the world, we're offered countless opportunities to reflect on, adjust, or reinforce those ideas through the mirrors and windows provided by interactions with others. Fleeting connections with Uber drivers or park attendants or security guards, brief conversations with acquaintances, hours chatting with friends, long phone calls with family, they are all opportunities for us to understand ourselves more deeply. Relationships are essential to our ability to perceive differently, to see and experience things through another perspective, to observe ourselves in a new way. As you probably noticed, I've been shifting the podcast toward a more narrative presentation, exploring ideas about who we are and how we are in the world through the lens of relationships. For this reason, I'm launching the second season under this new name. I hope you find the content more insightful, more inspiring, or at least more entertaining. So let's get started. As regular listeners of the podcast know, I recently did something I never thought I would do. I joined a dating app. Tinder, specifically. Not because I wanted casual hookups, although that's probably exactly what I'm looking for. I'll explore that more later. I chose Tinder because it's the most widely used here in Colombia. And as many of you know, my first forays into the world of digital matchmaking did not go especially well. I mean, they weren't terrible, but I haven't had any particularly wonderful interactions yet either. Which is okay. As I've said numerous times, I'm not looking for anything even remotely serious, and I have no idea how long I'll be here in South America. While admittedly not specifically what I was expecting or hoping for, the interactions I've had have been interesting, enlightening. I've gotten a much clearer sense of the kind of man I'm attracted to, and perhaps a more realistic perspective on the kind of men that I attract. And several cups of free coffee, even a beer or two, so, that's something. I swiped right on Jeff's photos because he's attractive, educated as far as I could tell, likes to travel, the usual reasons. And I was low-key interested when he messaged me with the usual initial interactions. He asked about where I was from, what I did for work, the basic stuff. But when I responded and then posed the same questions back to him, he almost never answered. Yellow flags. Nothing to get too concerned about, but a reminder to proceed with caution. When he called me a few hours later, the flags all turned to a deep shade of orange. In the age of texting and voice notes and DMs, voice-on-voice action feels just a little too intimate, like going for the handhold in the first couple of seconds of an in-person interaction. I mean, I realize that phone calls are still the most comfortable form of communication for a lot of people, but I barely tolerate phone calls with my family, and I only speak to my sister and my very best friends at length. I ignored both of his calls that first night. There were messages from him when I woke up the next morning, and at the comfortable communication distance of texting, I responded politely, but with little enthusiasm. Just as I was finishing up my work that evening, he called again, twice. I ignored them again. Finally, on the third evening, I answered his call, almost accidentally, and was shocked that he was video calling me. It was like he had gone straight for the ass squeeze, and I was immediately uncomfortable, and I told him so. I hate video calls, I confessed, laughing uncomfortably. Why did you do this to me? To see what you look like, he said, grinning. I felt flames rush up my neck and onto my cheeks. You're very pretty. Thank you, I said, fumbling for a way to get out of this horrifying situation. And what do you think of me? He asked before I could craft an exit. Do you like the way I look? Well, to start with, you appear much older than your photos suggest. You're laying in bed shirtless, which I should tell you is not a great look, and the fact that you have called me to see if I was actually attractive are pretty heavy turnoffs, if I'm honest. But of course I couldn't say that to him. So I just said, yeah, but I don't like to make an opinion of someone based solely on how they look. A half-truth, of course. The whole basis of Tinder is exactly that, making snap judgments on the connection you might have with a person based on a few photos and whatever basic information is offered up. He asked if we could see each other sometime. I gave a non-committal response and ended the call as quickly as possible, and never returned any of his subsequent messages. It's a little shitty, I know, but what was I going to say? That he totally turned me off? To his face? The thing is, I kind of get it. I'm in no way condoning how he went about it, but I think it's safe to assume that he was trying to determine whether or not there was a spark. That magic moment when two people are mutually attracted to one another and the air fills with excited anticipation for what more might come. Truly, I should probably be thanking him, or at least endorse the video call idea, because at least he saved me from having to fake interest to his face in real life long enough not to be a rude bitch and then ghost him. I could have wasted hours getting ready for a date, going on the date, realizing immediately that I wasn't interested, and then going home disappointed and wishing I'd stayed on my couch. At least in this version of the situation, I had lost no more than a few minutes. In the dating world, the spark is essential. I mean, how else would we narrow down in the sea of faces that flow in and out of our lives on a day-to-day basis the ones in whom we're interested? Short of initiating interactions with literally every person that crosses our path, it feels like there's really no other option than to depend on the chemical reaction that happens in our brains when we encounter someone to whom we're attracted. This vetting system, while admittedly something less than 100% reliable, feels ever more essential the older we get. As people flood out of the dating pool and into marriages or relationships or just the surrender to the bliss of a single life, our options shrink. And that shrinking pool gets even smaller as we learn from previous relationships what kind of people interest us and what kind of people we know will never be compatible. It seems that regardless of the kind of interactions or relationships we're looking for, we've collectively settled on the spark as the first determining factor in the success of a relationship. In Spanish, it's called la chispa, and we want it. As I think is probably true for most of us, there was a time in my very young life in which I felt like I sparked with almost any male human under the age of 20. The boy behind the sandwich counter with the whisper of a mustache, the scrawny gas station attendant with the adorable little dimples, the guy hawking cheap sunglasses at the mall. Awash in a sea of adolescent hormones, it felt like any young man that made eye contact with me was potential boyfriend material. Then, at a skating rink birthday party, at the tender age of 13, I experienced my first real chispa. He was not much taller than I, thick with the muscles of youth and eyes the color of espresso roast coffee. I assume now that it was his indigenous heritage that also gifted him with milk chocolate-colored skin and silky soft, almost black hair that he wore in a mohawk ponytail. Sparks everywhere. The skater and I dated for months and fell hard for each other, until he went to juvie for dealing drugs. Then there was the disarmingly beautiful gym rat, the somewhat frumpy and prematurely balding art major with eyes that reached to the bottom of my soul, the baby-faced world traveler, the wild man, and many others. I actually ended up marrying one of my chispa guys, though we only lasted a year or so. In hindsight, I think the initial spark was perhaps the high mark of our relationship. It faded fast, and so did the probability of a successful marriage. In fact, with perhaps only one exception, I think that's been true of every relationship I've ever had with a spark guy. The fact that I'm still single only adds to the significant body of anecdotal evidence that chasing the chispa may not be well advised. There's even a good bit of science behind the theory. The reason? Because while we perceive this instant chemical attraction to be indicative of the potentiality, it's often something else entirely, namely a trauma response from a previous relationship that left us feeling unloved and wanting more. I'll explore that idea further over at Patreon. Adding to the mounting body of evidence is the reality that often relationships that begin with a spark end with a charred and smoldering landscape. The truth is, even 30 years after my brief relationship with the skater, I still spark, a lot. Perhaps it's the innate desperation of my singlehood, or just the deep need for some kind of social interaction. Whatever it is, I experience teeny tiny little chispas all the time. They don't mean anything, of course. They're almost non-encounters, the kind where I pass a beautiful man on the street and he holds my gaze or gives me a smile. I don't suddenly start to sashay down the sidewalk dreaming of a future with him, nor do I turn to catch up to him and ask him out. I've always just kind of surrendered that part of the interaction to the whim of the universe. If this is someone with whom I'm truly meant to have some kind of significant shared experience, we'll eventually cross paths again. He will turn to come down the sidewalk, tap me on the shoulder, and ask for my phone number. Although that's never happened. There's still sparks, though. That little something that makes this person stand out in an ocean of humans and connect with us for even just a fraction of a moment. Do they mean nothing? Or is it possible that this seemingly built-in biometric relationship viability evaluator is actually trying to tell us exactly the opposite of what we've thought all along? That if we spark with someone, it's a trauma response to a previously broken heart and more likely signifies that ultimately the relationship is doomed? It's a troubling thought, in all honesty, and one that we seem to beg to challenge. But don't we want the sparks? My dear friend Kara whined. Aren't we telling ourselves that we're good enough, deserving enough for magic relationships? Yes, absolutely. I've been telling myself that for decades. Honestly, I've been preaching that idea to anyone that will listen, because of course I believe that we all deserve real love, deep connection, passion, commitment, emotional availability. Of course, I, like many, many women, people around the world, love the idea that somewhere out there wandering the planet is the other half of our soul, the perfect person that will make getting through this ridiculously hard and strange and wonderful life easier and more joyful. But I think maybe it's bullshit. Maybe we're holding fiercely to Disney and Hallmark and rom-com media narratives that don't exist in real life. It's so easy to say we're pragmatic enough to understand that Hollywood portrayals of romance aren't real. But on some level, we so desperately want them to be that we keep looking for that. And when our relationships don't live up to those realities, we leave them, or at least doubt them. Sparks set off fires, some of them tiny little flames at the tip of a lighter, some of them raging forest fires. And the ones we seem to keep chasing are the kind that set off fireworks. Kara met Remy on a party boat in the heat of summer when the air feels thick with sexual energy and everyone is beating the heat by enjoying cold adult beverages and bearing as much skin as possible. They talked and laughed and exchanged phone numbers. Flirty texts passed between them for weeks. She caught herself imagining the way this stranger would love her, the adoring messages he would send that would eventually turn into conversations about a relationship and then marriage and their future children. But rather than adoring, his messages devolved to just polite, and then ceased altogether. She chastised herself for creating a reality in her mind that hadn't actually existed. After all, they hadn't even kissed. And with some emotional and chronological distance, she could see that he would not have been a great match for her anyway. Through their brief and limited conversation, she'd learned he was a devout partier and committed only to a lack of commitment. That's the thing about fireworks. They can be so brilliant, so beautiful, so awe-inspiring that they distract us from what's really going on in the darkness. It's easy to become entranced by the display, so much so that it's all that we can see, utterly losing our sense of time, and perhaps ourselves, as we gaze in awe at the sky exploding in front of us. So what? We'd be well advised to ignore those intoxicating sparks and give those guys for whom we feel very little a chance? Like the real estate investor who took me out for coffee and then challenged my thoughts and beliefs about empowering women, but then followed up our date with messages about how much he'd enjoyed our time together. Really? Because for me, it felt a lot like we just disagreed about everything. Or perhaps I should have taken a second glance at the video call guy. I just can't get my head around the idea that that is the right way to go, even when there is some compatibility. Back in my mid-20s, a slight, sinewy man with a long braid of brown hair started his first day at the place where I'd been working for a little over a year. I was instantly attracted. For the better part of the morning, I adjusted my route between my office and the administrative wing to cross his path as often as possible. By the time we were winding up for the day, I found myself asking him out for a beer. Quite uncharacteristic of me. He was attractive and awkward, which only further endeared me to him. By the time he took me home that night, the itty-bitty spark I'd felt had fully burned out, but it had caught upon something else, something deeper. We dated for a few months and I felt myself growing to love him in some way. But it certainly wasn't electric, explosive. We skied and hiked and rode motorcycles together. We cooked and watched movies while the snow fell outside. We cuddled and had good sex. I could have married him, and I'm sure he would have worked hard to make our relationship work, to make me happy, to get us to the finish line of old age together. But I wasn't in love with him. I didn't want a relationship that worked in the logical sense but lacked passion. I didn't need someone to help me raise children. I didn't want children. I didn't need someone to help me get to retirement. I was sure I could get there myself, or die before I needed to worry about it. I didn't need someone to take care of me when I was old and gray. I could pay people to do that. We had a relationship that was just fine, but that I ended after a couple of years together because I didn't want fine. I wanted love. I wanted fireworks. Maybe if I'd been looking for an actual partner, a long-term, let's get hitched someday kind of relationship, I would have been able to release the desire for the passionate love. Acknowledge that marriages that last are often built on much more pragmatic metrics. Do you enjoy doing the same kinds of things? Do you feel like you can depend on this person to help you build a secure financial future? Is this the kind of person you would want helping you to raise your children or support you as you work toward big career goals? Can you see yourself enjoying spending time together, even after 30 years of them farting in bed or getting the refrigerator door handle all sticky? So many marriages end in divorce, or they end up being sexless, that it makes me wonder if it's even worth pursuing the long, slow burn kind of relationship. Do we really want that, or has it been programmed into us? What if we let go of the idea of looking for relationships that develop from the spark and focus on just enjoying the fireworks for as long as they last? Mr. Mary Jane and I had a great couple of early dates. He was open and romantic and sensual. We spent long hours on the couch making out or draped over each other in the kitchen while I prepared food and he enjoyed appetizers. He was attractive, kind, attentive. So I was somewhat disappointed to discover that as soon as he began talking about his desire to be in a relationship, specifically with me, my attraction to him plummeted. Was it the fact that he was too eager or that I wasn't ready? Then I had a devastating thought. Maybe he was too emotionally available. Maybe the part of me that wants fireworks is chasing chispa guys that aren't actually a good fit, the emotionally immature, unavailable ones with whom I feel all kinds of chemistry, but that are in no way compatible. Is it possible that we, have such a twisted view of what it feels like to be loved that on some subconscious level, we believe it isn't real unless we have to beg for it? Or is it just that we're addicted to the chispa? But really, isn't that thing we're chasing essentially a charged up version of the feeling we get when we're attracted to anyone? If we drool over Jason Momoa in movies, wouldn't we feel a power surge if he walked into our living room? Regardless of the viability of a partnership with a human like that, everything in our brains and bodies would be crackling as though we were connected to a car battery, right? So the spark really is just the mark of attraction and nothing more? It makes perfect sense to me that if we're looking for relationships that could span more than a half a century, that we should be looking for the slow burn kind. The ones that seem to start out with little more than a single crackling spark at the end of a flint, but grow slowly, steadily. Those are the ones that will eventually burn at metal melting temperatures. And even when the fire dies down, the embers will still be so hot that you can just add a little more kindling and up it rises again. To be honest, I'm not sure I'll ever be interested in a deep romantic love with someone. Although, as I've said before, at this stage of my life it seems much more plausible. Not because I know myself better or love myself more deeply, though those things are more true as well. I think it's more plausible because happily spending 20 years of my life with someone seems much more doable than happily spending 60 years of my life with someone. Happily being the operative term there. Maybe all those little sparks are ultimately just the initial connection, the universe telling us that it's possible that there might be something there for us. But that if we want it to be a long-term love, we have to kind of control that spark and not let it start a raging wildfire. For my part, for now, I'm going to keep chasing the chispa, knowing that it's not just possible, but likely that it won't become a more serious relationship, because that's just where I am in my healing and growth process. But maybe in keeping that initial emotional distance, I'll actually make space for the possibility that someday it will evolve to something more and be better for the fact that I didn't let it burn too hot from the start. I hope you enjoy a week filled with fireworks in all areas of your life. Join me next time for more stories about navigating and enjoying the ridiculously beautiful gift it is to be human. If you liked this podcast, please remember to subscribe and consider supporting us on Patreon, where I'll share the more intimate stories, the deeper dives, and explore how we can love ourselves and our lives more through these experiences. Learn more at patreon.com/Jacqueline Lene. And if you'd like to create more pleasure and self-love in your own life, check out the books, workshops, and personal support programs offered on my website at www.authorjacquelinelanae.com. That's JACLYNLANAE. Thanks for listening.